Paying bills is never easy, but it's even harder to do so when you don't have the sufficient funds. These funds are dependent on your salary or hourly wage. Minimum wage is the lowest remuneration that employers can legally pay their workers. Our federal minimum wage is $7.25. In California, our minimum wage is $12 an hour. The minimum wage doesn't seem that it affects many people's lives, although there is a huge problem that our minimum wage is this low. An article written by the Economic Policy Institute wrote that minimum wage is worth 17% less now than it was in 2009, which was 11 years ago, and 31% less than it was in 1968. Why is this? Minimum wage doesn't keep up with inflation. So minimum wage doesn't increase with inflation. So as our inflation increases each year, our minimum wage stays the same, which affects us directly because we aren't able to pay as much as things are costing with what we're making. Another article written by a campaign website for Bernie Sanders wrote that 20% of families live in poverty due to not being able to support themselves because they're living off of minimum wage. There are many problems with minimum wage that we don't even know. Not being able to pay your utility bills, not being able to buy school supplies for your children, not being able to pay your car bill or your insurance, or even buy food for yourself because you don't have enough money because you're not making enough. The common misconception with minimum wage is that just because you're living off minimum wage, if you're able to work hard enough and get those hours, that you're going to be making enough money. But even with the $12 an hour that California offers as minimum wage, if you're working 40 hours a week, that's 80 hours in one paycheck, which means that you're making only $1,920 a month, which is less than $2,000, which is barely able to cover your utility bills, let alone if you need food, your car insurance, if you have kids, any little item that you may need that is essential, but you aren't able to provide for yourself or your family. How do we combat the fact that minimum wage is so low and not keeping up with inflation? Raise the minimum wage. By raising the minimum wage, we would be able to keep up with inflation so that as the minimum wage increases, inflation also increases, but we'll be able to afford those things that inflation is affecting. So that way, we'll be able to pay bills more, we'll be able to stimulate the economy, and we'll be able to support ourselves a lot better than if we were just making $7.25 or $12. Or in different states, it could be like $9, $8. It just depends on the cost of living. An article written by Politics of Poverty wrote that if we were to raise the minimum wage, 40 million workers would be out of poverty. And the same article also wrote about the benefits of raising the minimum wage. Raising the minimum wage would fuel economic growth. When people are making more, they're willing to spend more, which means that they're willing to shop more. They're willing to go out and go to restaurants and buy more, eat more. And this positively affects our economy. Although, even if we do raise the minimum wage, there are some objections. Article written by Cato Institute by author Jeffrey Clemens wrote that many people believe that if we were to raise minimum wage, many workers would actually be laid off, which would be the opposite of what we're trying to accomplish. Although this is a misconception, because as I mentioned before, if people are making more, they're willing to spend more, which would stimulate our economy. So the fact that businesses wouldn't be able to afford to pay their workers more is combated with economic growth because they'd be making more from their customers and their clients, which in turn they'd be giving to their workers, which is the biggest misconception with raising the minimum wage. But if we think about the positive effects, those will lead to the solutions for objections. So what would it look like if we were to raise the minimum wage? If we were to raise the minimum wage, it would stimulate the economy. As I mentioned before, people will spend more. It would also reduce poverty. As I mentioned before, 40 million workers would be out of poverty. And not even just those living in poverty, those who are barely living paycheck to paycheck would be able to afford more. And even though that's not technically considered poverty, that's still considered those who are struggling. So that would help many, many people who are struggling to keep up with essential necessities. It would also keep up with inflation. So inflation raises the price prices of food, of clothing, of different things that businesses sell to us each year, because those costs are raised each year. And since minimum wage currently isn't keeping up with it, we aren't able to afford things because of inflation. But if minimum wage was able to keep up with inflation, then there wouldn't be a problem there. Also, the government's burden would greatly decrease because many people are dependent on unemployment or government paychecks, the safety net of the government, so to say, and the government wouldn't have to support as many families and people. Also, employees would stay longer with their employers because they wouldn't have to consistently look for a better paying job who offers more benefits. With all of this being said, how are you and I able to take action, and how are we able to get involved? Simply said, raising the minimum wage is easier said than done, although there are ways that you and I can get involved. There is a website called raisetheminimumwage.com where there are different articles about campaigns, petitions that you're able to get involved in to raise minimum wage. There are also protests. Obviously, we can't really do that right now, but there are protests that you can get involved in if you are very passionate about this subject. So I encourage each and every one of you to go on this website, to look at the campaigns, to get involved with the campaigns, to get involved with the petitions, because the minimum wage affects so many people that you and I know. Even if you don't know that they're struggling, many people are struggling from the minimum wage because they aren't able to afford things that you and I are able to afford. The person sitting next to you possibly could be struggling because they're barely scraping by because they're barely making $12 or $7.25, depending on their job. Minimum wage affects so many people, and I encourage you to get involved because it feels good when you're able to pay your bills. It feels good when you're able to buy that new pair of shoes. It feels good when you're able to buy your child a meal, and it feels good when you're able to support your family. But even if you don't know what it feels like, ask someone what it feels like, or imagine what it feels like to not being able to support yourself, or not being able to pay your electricity bill and your electricity goes off. Thank you for listening.